The sun had barely risen over Washington, D.C., casting warm shades of orange and pink across the sky as Jungkook stepped into Reagan National Airport. At 27, he wasn't traveling with an entourage or security, just a simple black hoodie, worn jeans, and a backpack filled with handwritten notes for his speech at a youth mental health summit in New York City. The summit wasn't about celebrity, it was about lived experience. His story, his words. His uncle had reminded him the night before, "You're there because of your honesty and your heart. That's yours. No one gets to take that away." The airport was alive with the usual hum of early travelers, announcements blaring, suitcase wheels clacking, espresso machines hissing behind kiosks. Jungkook kept his head down as he made his way to the check-in counter. The woman behind the desk, wearing a tag that read M. Cowell, barely looked up when he placed his passport and business class ticket on the counter. "Good morning," he said politely. She looked at the documents, then at him, her eyes narrowing with something between disbelief and judgment. "Flying to New York? Business class?" she asked. "Yes," he replied calmly. She picked up the ticket, turning it over like it was a fake. "Are you sure this is your ticket?" she asked, voice tight. Jungkook blinked, caught off guard but composed. "Yes. Is there a problem?" She didn't answer directly, just stared at her screen longer than necessary. "We don't usually see passengers like..." She stopped mid-sentence, realizing perhaps what she was implying, and corrected herself. "Never mind. Just confirming." Jungkook felt the insult, but he didn't let it show. When Cowell leaned over and whispered to another nearby employee, pointing at him, the heat in his chest began to rise. The man walked over with a grim look, examined Jungkook's ID with an air of forced skepticism, and asked, "This is for business class?" Jungkook nodded. "Yes, it is." The man gave Cowell a look, then stepped aside. "Fine. Go ahead," he muttered. Jungkook walked towards security, jaw clenched, trying to block out the stares and whispers from other passengers. He reminded himself of what mattered, his purpose, not their assumptions. At the security checkpoint, he placed his bag on the belt, passed through the metal detector, and reached out to grab his backpack when another agent suddenly blocked his way. "Sir, we need to do a secondary screening," the agent said without eye contact. "Why?" Jungkook asked. "Just a random check," the agent replied, but the tone gave away something colder. Jungkook was led behind a partition where the pat-down was more invasive than necessary. His bag was torn apart, his notebook flipped through like contraband. "Who paid for your ticket?" one agent asked, holding up his boarding pass. "I did," Jungkook said. "I'm speaking at a youth mental health summit." The agent raised an eyebrow. "Pretty upscale summit if you're flying business class." Jungkook's face flushed, but he kept his cool. He didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing anger. Finally, his belongings were returned with a hollow, "You're good to go." He looked at his watch, less than an hour until boarding, and moved quickly toward his gate. But as he approached, he noticed a group of staff whispering and glancing in his direction again. A middle-aged woman with a stiff smile stepped forward and blocked his path. "I need to see your ID and ticket again," she said. Jungkook handed them over without a word. She stared at them, then frowned. "There's been a flag on your ticket. I'll need you to come with me." "What kind of flag?" he asked. "Just a routine verification," she said, already walking away. Something in his gut told him this wasn't routine, but he followed her anyway, heart pounding, unsure what exactly they thought he had done wrong. "I'm sorry, but we can't allow you to board this flight," the woman said, her voice icy and absolute. "You'll need to leave the airport." Jungkook stared at her, stunned. "What? Why?" he asked, his voice low but sharp with disbelief. The woman shrugged. "We have our reasons." A wave of fury surged through him. "This is unacceptable," he said, his tone trembling under pressure. "I haven't done anything wrong." She crossed her arms. "If you don't leave willingly, we'll have security escort you out." Jungkook's fists clenched. His heart pounded, and he could feel his face flushing with humiliation. He stood there, jaw tight, refusing to break, refusing to let them see even one tear. Without a word, he pulled out his phone and called the one person who had always known how to cut through the noise, his uncle. "Hyung, I need you," Jungkook said, his voice shaking. Barack Obama's voice came through the line steady and sure. "I'm on my way." But those words, comforting as they were, weren't enough to quiet the storm inside him. He stood alone in a sterile corridor just off the main terminal, next to a door marked, "Authorized personnel only." The woman who had dragged him here had already left. The chaos of the airport buzzed somewhere beyond the wall, but here it was eerily quiet. Jungkook clutched his bag, his fingers trembling, every nerve in his body alive with adrenaline. Part of him wanted to step back into the terminal, at least out there were witnesses, but something told him not to move. Not yet. His phone buzzed. A message from his uncle. "I'll be there in 15 minutes. Stay where you are." He took a shaky breath. The reassurance steadied him just enough, but the sting of what had just happened, and how easily it had happened, still burned. Why had he been singled out? Was it the hoodie? The way he looked? The silence he carried? He played the morning back in his mind. The whispers, the scanning eyes, the assumptions. He had grown up watching the subtle, silent ways that bias crept in. But this wasn't silent. This was blatant. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps snapped him from his thoughts. 2 agents appeared at the end of the corridor, 1 man, 1 woman. Their postures were stiff, their faces unreadable. The man carried a clipboard like a shield. The woman held a handheld scanner. "Sir," the man said curtly, "we need to conduct an additional screening. Please place your bag on the table." Jungkook's jaw tightened. "I've already been screened twice," he said. His voice was composed, but firm. Not raised, not angry, just solid. "This is a random check," the woman said, her expression flat. "Compliance is mandatory." Jungkook hesitated, then set his bag on the table. He watched as they unzipped it and began rifling through his things like none of it mattered. His laptop was flipped open. His toiletry bag dumped across the surface. "Is this really necessary?" he asked, his voice tight with frustration he was trying hard to contain. The male agent didn't answer. He picked up a paperback from Jungkook's bag and turned it over suspiciously. "What's this?" he asked, like it was contraband. "A book. For the summit I'm attending," Jungkook replied. The agent squinted at the title, frowned as if it were in a foreign language, then tossed it aside with a shrug. The woman scanned his laptop slowly, deliberately, like she enjoyed drawing it out. Jungkook glanced around. The corridor was still empty. No one to witness, no one to stop this. After several minutes, the agent stepped back. The man looked up from his clipboard. "We'll need to hold on to your bag for further analysis," he said flatly. "What?" "No," Jungkook said, stepping forward instinctively. "You can't just take my things. I have a flight to catch." The woman's expression darkened. "If you don't cooperate, sir, we'll have to escalate this matter." "Escalate," Jungkook repeated, his voice rising in spite of himself. "You've already humiliated me, invaded my privacy, and now you're trying to steal my belongings. What exactly are you escalating to?" His words echoed off the corridor walls, sharp and clear, and still no one came. "You've already humiliated me in front of everyone at security, and now you're trying to take my things? This is harassment," Jungkook snapped, his voice echoing sharply through the empty corridor. The 2 agents exchanged glances. Their expressions were unreadable, blank, detached, clinical. Then the male agent stepped forward with that same cold, bureaucratic smile. "You need to calm down," he said, condescending and composed. "We're just doing our job." Jungkook inhaled deeply, forcing his hands to relax at his sides, though his chest was tight and his throat burned. He couldn't afford to lose control. "Not now. Not here. I'm not going anywhere without my bag," he said, quieter now, but unwavering. The male agent opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a new presence entered the corridor. It was the airport manager, the same woman who had whispered behind the counter earlier, now flanked by 2 security guards. Their appearance made the already suffocating space feel even smaller. "What's going on here?" the manager asked sharply, her voice slicing through the tension like a blade. The female agent straightened immediately. "We're conducting a secondary screening. He's refusing to comply." "That's not true," Jungkook interrupted, his voice rising with pent-up frustration. "I've complied with everything. Now they're trying to take my bag for no reason." The manager's eyes scanned him from head to toe. "This is becoming a disruption, sir. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the airport." The words hit him like a punch to the chest. "You can't be serious," he said, barely above a whisper. I've done nothing wrong. The woman didn't flinch. We reserve the right to deny service to anyone who poses a potential security risk. Jungkook stared at her, disbelief crashing into fury. A security risk? He repeated, incredulous. You're calling me that because of how I look? The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The guards stepped forward, their stances hardening. Jungkook's breath quickened. His hands trembled again, but not from fear, from outrage. I'm calling my uncle, he said, more calmly than he felt. He pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking as he dialed. The manager pressed her lips together but said nothing. Jungkook raised the phone to his ear. It rang only once before being answered. Hyung, he said quietly. They're kicking me out of the airport. Barack Obama's voice came through with quiet strength. Stay where you are. I'm on my way. As the call ended, Jungkook turned to face the agents and the manager. My uncle is on his way, he said. His voice carried a weight that exceeded his youth, his stature, or his quiet nature. I suggest you think very carefully about what you do next. The manager faltered just for a moment. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. But before she could gather a response, the male agent leaned in with a smirk. Daddy's coming to save the day, huh? He muttered just loud enough for Jungkook to hear. Jungkook didn't bite. He simply stepped back and leaned against the wall, folding his arms tightly across his chest. The guards kept staring at him, their eyes heavy with judgment. But he didn't flinch. He didn't fold. Beyond the corridor walls, the terminal remained alive with noise, boarding calls, moving crowds, a world that didn't stop. But for Jungkook, time stood still. Each second dragged like an eternity. And then, footsteps, not rushed, not heavy, measured, certain, calm. He looked up. At the end of the corridor, Barack Obama appeared like the first break of sunlight after a storm. His stride was steady, his expression unreadable but full of quiet force. His presence drew the attention of everyone in the hall like gravity. The guards stood straighter. The agents snapped out of their indifference. The manager, suddenly unsure of herself, adjusted her blazer and forced a tight smile. Jungkook pushed off the wall and took a slow step forward, the weight in his chest lifting just slightly. His uncle's presence always had that effect, like armor without the noise. Are you all right? Barack asked, his voice measured and calm, as though he hadn't even noticed the storm of tension that had filled the corridor. Jungkook nodded, but his voice cracked as he tried to speak. They were going to kick me out of the airport. Barack's gaze shifted to the manager, his eyes unreadable, but they carried weight, the kind that demanded truth without needing to raise a voice. Is that true? He asked, his tone polite, yet unmistakably firm. The manager hesitated, glancing toward the two agents as if searching for backup. Sir, she began, her voice laced with defensive undertones. We had concerns about his behavior. He was becoming disruptive. We have protocols for this sort of situation. Disruptive, Barack repeated, raising a single eyebrow. His composure didn't break, but there was a sharper edge beneath the calm. Can you explain exactly how my nephew was being disruptive? Before the manager could respond, the male agent jumped in, full of misplaced confidence. He refused to comply with our security procedures. We were just doing our job. That's not true, Jungkook interjected, his voice trembling. Not with fear, but with anger. I complied with everything you asked. You treated me like a criminal for no reason. And the moment I pushed back, suddenly I became a problem. The agent's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The manager looked smaller now, her confidence shrinking beneath Barack's gaze. He scanned the group slowly, letting the silence hang for just long enough before speaking again. It seems to me there's been a serious misunderstanding, he said. His voice was even, but his presence filled the space like thunderclouds rolling in. Let's get something clear. First, my nephew is not leaving this airport unless he chooses to. Second, I want a detailed explanation of why he was singled out in the first place. The manager cleared her throat, her composure faltering. Sir, as I said, we have protocols. His ticket was flagged, and we followed up accordingly. Flagged for what? Barack asked, this time with an unmistakable hint of impatience. He had a valid ticket, valid ID, and a reason to travel. So what exactly flagged him for extra scrutiny? The manager stammered, her words drying up. The male agent crossed his arms. Sometimes we have to make judgment calls, he said stiffly. Especially when something just doesn't feel right. Barack's eyes narrowed, and his voice dropped slightly. Something didn't feel right, he repeated, his words like iron. You made a judgment call based on how he looks, didn't you? The tension in the corridor turned suffocating. The female agent glanced at her colleague, avoiding his eyes now. The silence stretched long and wide. I assure you, sir, the manager finally said, her voice shaky. We don't tolerate discrimination in this airport. That's a lovely policy, Barack replied coolly. But actions speak louder than posters on a wall. From where I'm standing, this reeks of bias. My nephew is standing here humiliated and distressed, because your team decided he didn't look like someone who belongs in business class. Am I wrong? No one answered, and the silence itself became its own admission. Barack exhaled slowly, disappointment clinging to the sound. He turned to Jungkook, his expression softening just a bit. Are you ready to go? He asked gently. Jungkook nodded, clutching his bag like a lifeline. He was ready to leave this nightmare, but not to forget it. They turned to go, but the manager stammered behind them. Wait, sir. Perhaps we can discuss this further. Barack paused. He didn't turn back. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady, but carried the unmistakable tone of warning. You'll be hearing from me, and I suggest you prepare yourselves for a thorough review of your so-called protocols. Without another word, he placed a hand on Jungkook's shoulder and guided him back toward the terminal. The corridor behind them remained hauntingly silent, filled not just with guilt, but the weight of consequences. As they walked, Jungkook felt torn between relief and unresolved fury. He glanced at his uncle, trying to read his face, but Barack's expression stayed focused, his eyes scanning forward. Hyung, Jungkook began quietly. I'm sorry you had to come down here. I didn't know what else to do. Barack stopped and turned to him. His hands rested gently on Jungkook's shoulders. You don't have to apologize, he said, with unwavering clarity. You stood up for yourself. What happened here today? It was wrong, but it wasn't your fault, and you were absolutely right to call me. You did the right thing by calling me, Barack said gently. His words soothed some of the tension knotted in Jungkook's chest, but the sting of what had happened still lingered like smoke after a fire. They treated me like I didn't belong, Jungkook said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I know, Barack replied, his tone heavy with restrained anger and sadness, and they're going to answer for it. As the two of them walked back toward the main terminal, the ambient noise of airport life began to seep back in. The boarding calls, the rolling luggage, the dull murmur of conversations. After the cold silence of the corridor, it felt strangely jarring. Jungkook glanced up at his uncle. Barack's calm exterior was intact, but Jungkook recognized the tension in his stride. A controlled intensity, the quiet kind of fury that his uncle rarely let surface but always carried beneath. The weight of the morning pressed down on Jungkook's shoulders. The stares, the whispers, the insinuations, the invasive pat-downs. It was exhausting. And yet, beside him walked someone who refused to let injustice go unanswered. Barack's presence felt like an anchor in a sea of humiliation. They stopped near a row of chairs, just far enough from the security checkpoint to escape watchful eyes, but close enough for Barack to keep his protective instincts on alert. Jungkook sat down, clutching his bag like a shield. Barack remained standing, scanning the area with quiet vigilance. Hyung, Jungkook said, his voice soft but strained. I don't want this to happen to anyone else. His words hung in the air for a moment. Then Barack nodded once. It won't, he said firmly. We'll make sure of that. Just then, a uniformed airline representative approached, flanked by two uneasy-looking staff members. The woman leading the group wore a name tag that read M. Patel. Her face was a blend of forced calm and barely hidden discomfort. Mr. Obama, she began, her voice carefully measured. On behalf of the airport and the airline, I want to apologize for any inconvenience you and your nephew have experienced this morning. Barack turned to her fully, his expression unreadable. Inconvenience, he repeated, his voice even but laced with quiet steel. The word alone made her shift uncomfortably. Is that what you're calling this? Patel hesitated. I assure you, we take these matters very seriously. I've been informed of the situation, and I want you to know we're looking into it. Looking into it, Barack echoed, the clipped tone of his voice cutting through the scripted language. Let me be clear, Ms. Patel. My nephew was humiliated, singled out, and treated like a threat, for no other reason than someone's gut feeling. That's not an inconvenience. That's discrimination. And if your staff can't tell the difference, then you have a much bigger problem than you think. Jungkook stood quietly beside him, listening. He felt a swirl of vindication and frustration. Watching his uncle speak up was empowering, but the ache of what he'd experienced still burned beneath the surface. Patel's professional composure began to falter. She looked back at her colleagues, as if hoping one of them might speak up. None did. We deeply regret what happened, she said finally, her voice softer now. If there's anything we can do to make this right. There is, Barack interrupted, his voice composed but carrying unmistakable gravity. First, I want the names of every staff member and TSA agent involved in this incident. Second, I expect a full report on the protocols that allowed this to happen in the first place. And third, this kind of behavior isn't just addressed, it gets eradicated. Patel fumbled for her notepad, scribbling furiously. Of course, Mr. Obama. I'll personally oversee the investigation. You'll do more than oversee, Barack said. You'll act, because if I don't see immediate, concrete change, I'll make sure this incident reaches every major news outlet in the country. Though delivered with poise, the warning in his words sent a ripple of anxiety through the group. Patel nodded rapidly, still writing, her colleagues stepping back as if to avoid the weight of accountability. Once they retreated, Barack turned back to Jungkook and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. We're not done here, he said quietly. But first, let's get you on that flight. The airline delayed the departure to accommodate them, a decision that sent waves of whispers through the terminal. Some passengers craned their necks to catch a glimpse of the former president. Others murmured, unaware of the story unfolding just behind the gates. Jungkook, feeling the burn of their stares, kept his eyes down and followed his uncle silently toward the gate. The young gate agent, visibly nervous, scanned their boarding passes with trembling hands and said, "Have a great flight, Mr. Obama." Barack gave a polite nod. Jungkook said nothing, but his silence was no longer about fear. It was about resolve. The gate agent scanned their boarding passes with exaggerated politeness. "Have a great flight, Mr. Obama," he said, his voice trembling slightly. Barack offered a curt nod, his focus unwavering as they walked down the jet bridge. Jungkook followed silently, and only once the gate closed behind them did he finally let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. For the first time that morning, he felt a flicker of relief. Once they were seated, Barack turned to him. His expression softened. "You okay?" Jungkook nodded, but his voice betrayed his exhaustion. "I'm just tired." Barack placed a firm, steady hand over his. "I know, but you did the right thing, standing up for yourself, calling me. That takes courage." Jungkook's eyes welled up, but he blinked the tears away. "It shouldn't have to," he whispered. "No," Barack agreed quietly. "It shouldn't. But until people stop making assumptions based on how someone looks, we have to keep pushing back." The flight itself passed without incident, but Jungkook couldn't shake the heaviness that had settled over him. He stared out the window, watching the clouds drift endlessly below. His mind replayed every moment. The stares, the pat-downs, the insinuations, the smirks. People who never once stopped to consider the weight of their actions. People who treated dignity like a privilege, not a right. "What are you thinking about?" Barack's voice broke through the silence. Jungkook turned to him, his eyes steady. "How to make sure this never happens again." Barack smiled faintly, a glimmer of pride in his gaze. "Good. Because this fight, it's not just about you or me. It's about everyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong." Those words rooted themselves deep in Jungkook's heart. They didn't just fill the silence, they gave it shape. By the time they landed at JFK in New York, Jungkook was no longer just recovering from the morning. He was beginning to transform it into purpose. As they exited the plane, Barack's phone buzzed. He read the message quickly, and a shadow passed over his face. "What is it?" Jungkook asked. Barack handed him the phone. It was an email from Patel, the airline representative, outlining the immediate steps being taken. But what caught Jungkook's eye was the final line. We have also placed the agents involved on administrative leave, pending further investigation. It was a start. The two walked through the terminal in silence, the words hanging between them. The administrative leave felt like a small victory, but nowhere near enough to erase what had been done. Barack slipped the phone back into his pocket, his jaw tight, his mind already a few steps ahead, mapping the next phase. Jungkook, meanwhile, still carried the rawness of the morning. The invasion of his privacy, the suspicion, the way they spoke to him like he didn't matter. Each moment clung to him like thorns he couldn't shake off. Outside, the chaos of New York filled the air with honks, sirens, and movement, but it brought little comfort. As they slid into the back seat of a waiting car, Jungkook spoke again. "Do you think anything will actually change?" he asked quietly. "I mean, they suspended the agents, but isn't that just damage control?" Barack turned to him, his gaze steady and direct. "You're right to be skeptical. Suspensions are a start, but they're not justice. Accountability has to go deeper. The systems that let this happen need to be dismantled." Jungkook nodded, though the frustration inside him still simmered like embers. "I just don't want this to get swept under the rug." "It won't be," Barack said with certainty. "We'll make sure of that." As the car weaved through Manhattan traffic, Barack made a call to his team. His voice was calm but firm, outlined, precise, urgent. He detailed the events at Reagan National Airport from beginning to end, his tone signaling not just concern, but action. By the time they reached their destination, a plan was already in motion. And by the next morning, the world began to take notice. News outlets picked up the story. The headlines weren't vague. They were direct, stark, and accusatory. Jungkook targeted in airport discrimination scandal. Former president demands reform. That was the headline that swept through the internet like wildfire. Media outlets ran segments, social feeds exploded, and comment sections turned into battlegrounds. Barack Obama's office released an official statement later that day, calmly outlining the incident and calling for immediate reform. The tone was measured, but its message was unmistakable. This wasn't an isolated event, and the Obamas weren't going to let it disappear into silence. The response from the public was swift and divided. Supporters flooded social media with messages of solidarity. People of color, immigrants, and travelers from marginalized communities shared their own stories of being profiled at airports. But there was backlash too. Critics accused Barack of using his influence unfairly. Some said he was overreacting. Some refused to even believe Jungkook had been mistreated. Yet despite the noise, one thing was clear. This struck a nerve. Within days, an internal investigation was launched at Reagan National Airport. The TSA and the airline involved were placed under scrutiny, and what began as a single complaint began unraveling into something bigger. Other passengers came forward. Whistleblowers from inside the TSA began to speak out, anonymously at first. Their accounts painted a grim picture, a toxic culture where bias was quietly accepted, where gut feelings justified excessive searches, and where supervisors looked the other way. The agents involved in Jungkook's case were suspended pending the outcome of the investigation, but public outrage was already burning. One of them, identified in leaked reports as Mark Henson, defended himself in statements, claiming his actions were based on procedure, not prejudice. But that didn't hold. Old videos of Henson surfaced, clips that showed him mocking passengers, rolling his eyes at travelers who spoke with accents, making dismissive remarks. Then came the tipping point. A fellow TSA employee, anonymously, confirmed that Henson had often made racist comments behind closed doors. That was the final straw. Henson was fired. The agents who enabled him followed. The manager who had given the final order to remove Jungkook from the terminal? She resigned under pressure after an internal review found her actions unjustified. For Jungkook, the fallout felt bittersweet. He watched it unfold in the media. Headlines, retweets, statements, apologies, and yet, none of it could undo the sting of that morning. He felt relief. He felt a grim sense of justice. But he also knew the story didn't end here. Over the following weeks, he began speaking out. Not just about what happened to him, but about the broader, deeper problem. Bias, assumption, how so many people were made to feel like outsiders simply because of where they came from, how they spoke, or what they wore. He gave interviews. He spoke at events. His words were raw and honest, and they resonated. Audiences across the country leaned in when Jungkook spoke, not because he was famous, but because his truth reflected theirs. Barack stood with him every step of the way. He offered guidance, quiet strength, and the kind of steady encouragement that didn't demand the spotlight. This wasn't just about an airport anymore. It was about accountability. It was about using a voice that couldn't be ignored to speak for those who never got the chance. But Barack didn't just shield Jungkook, he empowered him. One evening, as they prepared for a televised interview, Barack placed a hand on his nephew's shoulder and said quietly, "This is your fight too. You have the power to make a difference, Jungkook. Don't be afraid to use it." By the end of the month, the reforms Barack had championed were beginning to take root. TSA employees across the United States began undergoing mandatory bias training. A new hotline for reporting misconduct became operational, and though still in its early stages, an independent oversight committee had been formed, tasked with investigating abuse and holding those in power accountable. For Jungkook, these changes were a step in the right direction. But he knew better than to mistake progress for completion. What happened to him at Reagan National Airport was not just an isolated humiliation. It was a reminder of how much work remained, and how vital it was to speak out, even when your voice trembled. One morning, as sunlight painted the Washington skyline in gold, Barack sipped his coffee from the balcony of his home. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind: interviews, policy meetings, legislative drafts. But beneath the exhaustion, a quiet determination settled into his bones. This wasn't his first fight for systemic change. It wouldn't be his last. Inside, Jungkook stood in front of a mirror, adjusting his blazer. He had been invited to speak at a national conference on social justice and equity, his first major public address since the incident. The thought of standing before hundreds of strangers made his stomach flutter, but he knew his voice mattered now more than ever. Barack appeared in the doorway, his tone gentle. "How are you feeling?" "Nervous," Jungkook admitted. "But ready." Barack smiled. "You've got this. Just speak from the heart. People need to hear your truth." The words calmed him, but still, the weight of the moment pressed down on his shoulders. What had happened at Reagan wasn't just a personal experience. It was a window into a broken system. Jungkook was determined to keep that window open until something changed. The conference hall in downtown DC was grand and packed. Banners declaring justice, equity, accountability lined the walls. As Jungkook and Barack arrived, applause broke out. Flashbulbs popped. Eyes turned. Jungkook stayed close to his uncle, grounding himself in his quiet strength. The audience was a mosaic: activists, students, educators, lawmakers. When Jungkook stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. He took a deep breath, gripped the podium, and began. "Good morning. My name is Jungkook. I'm here today to share a story that, unfortunately, isn't unique to me." He paused, letting his words settle. "A few weeks ago, I was traveling to New York for a youth summit. What should have been a routine flight became a humiliating experience, one filled with suspicion, invasive searches, and silence. I wasn't pulled aside because I posed a threat. I was pulled aside because of how I was perceived." His voice grew stronger as he spoke. He described the dismissive tones, the whispered accusations, the way his dignity had been slowly stripped away. But he also spoke of the strength he found in standing firm, and the courage it took to speak out. "This isn't just about me," he said, his gaze sweeping the room. "It's about every person who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. It's about the systems that allow prejudice to go unchecked. And it's about the change we must demand together." The room erupted in applause. As Jungkook stepped down, Barack was waiting near the edge of the stage. He pulled his nephew into a quiet hug, eyes filled with pride. "You were incredible," he whispered. "That was exactly what people needed to hear." Jungkook felt a wave of pride, but also a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but he knew now that he had the strength to keep going. In the weeks that followed, the reforms Barack had initiated began to solidify. TSA bias training was expanded nationwide, with sessions designed not just to check boxes but to challenge assumptions and teach empathy. The Oversight Committee became active, investigating complaints that for years had gone ignored, and the Discrimination Reporting Hotline became a direct channel for passengers to seek justice in real time. What had started as a silent humiliation became a nationwide conversation. And at the heart of it stood a quiet young man who had simply wanted to board a plane, until the world made him stand for something greater. The changes that followed were met with mixed reactions. While many praised the reforms as an overdue step toward equity, others resisted, calling them excessive, unnecessary, even burdensome. But Barack was no stranger to that kind of opposition. He had faced it before, and he remained steadfast in his commitment to real, lasting change. Jungkook, too, kept advocating. He used his voice, his platform, to uplift others. In speeches, interviews, and honest social media posts, he shared his experience and encouraged others to share theirs. His story sparked difficult but necessary conversations. He wasn't just a voice for himself anymore. He had become a megaphone for everyone who had ever been silenced. One afternoon, Jungkook received an email from a young woman who had flown through Reagan National Airport just weeks after his incident. Her words were simple but powerful. "I don't know what changed, but I wanted to thank you. This time, I was treated with kindness and respect. Your story made a difference." Jungkook read the message twice. His heart swelled with a blend of gratitude and hope. He forwarded it to his uncle. Barack's reply was brief, but profound. "This is why we fight." In the months that followed, the ripple effects of Jungkook's experience spread. Other airports began adopting similar reforms. Advocacy groups pushed for broader changes, not just in transportation, but in policing, education, healthcare. The conversation about systemic bias began to grow louder and more urgent. For Jungkook, the experience had been transformative. It had been humiliating and painful, but it had also taught him something vital: the importance of resilience and the power of speaking out even when it feels hard. One quiet evening, he sat on the balcony beside his uncle, watching the city lights glitter like stars caught between buildings. "Do you think things will ever really change?" he asked, his voice low. Barack took a slow sip of coffee, his eyes on the skyline. "Change is slow," he said, "but every step forward matters. Every voice raised, every injustice challenged. It all adds up. And the fact that you're asking that question, the fact that you care enough to fight for a better future, that's how I know we're moving in the right direction." Jungkook nodded. The road ahead would be long, difficult, and sometimes lonely, but he was ready to walk it. The story of what happened to Jungkook at Reagan National Airport became more than a moment. It became a symbol, a reminder of how quickly dignity can be stripped, but also of how courage, when met with truth and solidarity, can reclaim it. It was a story about injustice, but more than that, it was a story about rising. And for Jungkook, it was just the beginning. Thank you for reading. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories inspired by real experiences. Share this video to help spark the conversations that lead to real change. See you in the next episode.